start sort of by taking a step backward um, from the book and from this chapter, and even from the issue of racism in general to race. So we're studying the history of the Christian church in America. So, but a bigger question is, what is history? Can anyone define what history is in kind of a concise way?
Well, it's his story, not her story. It's written by the victors, who were usually men, so it's his story.
Yeah, although the his is kind of incidental. I mean, you know, it's comes from the word historia, or actually its Latin equivalent, that's Russian. But in any case, you know, it's his and isn't really a part of it. It's simply the way in which the Latin word is rendered in a Roman, the English script. But what is history? It's something written by the victors.
It's an account of what happened, I guess. I mean, or at least it's an account of the way whoever's writing it, how that person viewed what has happened. I'm talking about when you're writing the history immediately upon it. Now I'm not making much sense, I guess.
So what is Christian history on a global scale?
It's everything that's happened since the resurrection worldwide. And maybe before, you know, life of Christ on.
Mm-hmm. So that's good. We have something before the old covenant, and then we have Christ, the resurrection, and out of that comes church history. So then how can we more generally answer the question of what is history?
My sense seems to be a little rattled after finding out all these things that have happened that I never even knew about before. So in some ways, it feels like a biased perspective, which becomes more generally accepted of what events have happened leading up to whatever.
Well, yeah, although that's a function of the fact that American history is falsified, and you know, in many ways is consistently a lie from start to finish. So, you know, I wouldn't call that history. I would call it a lie. Lies are lies.
Well, and yet there seems to be other. I mean, I can't think of another word besides perspective. Another slant on many sides of history. I mean, what's going on in Ukraine, and what does one side believe, and what does the other side believe? Maybe
if we begin to, you know, descend into complete relativism, then there's no such thing as history. There's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as God. There's no such thing as Christ. There's no such thing as anything else.
Can you tell I'm kind of cynical today?
So that's not a useful. So I mean, as since you know, so I was trained as a historian, and so I would define history as the study of the process of change. So history isn't a catalog of events. It's not, you know, lives of great people. It's not, the considerations of war or, the strategic movements and battles and whatever. History is the study of the process of change. So if anyone has their Bibles, turn to chapter 1, verse 1 of Hebrews. And we have a very concise definition of what history is, or a very concise view of the history of God's dealing with humanity. So the author of Hebrews writes, in many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the ages. He reflects the glory of God and bears the very stamp of his nature, upholding the universe by his word of power. That offers a view of history. So throughout history, we have a continuity. God speaks. So at all times, God is speaking. In old times, he spoke to the prophets. But now he speaks to us by his Son. So there's continuity, God speaks, and there's discontinuity. He spoke to the prophets, but the prophets are simply men who don't bear the very stamp of his nature. They bear the divine image, but they don't fully bear the divine image. All creation in some form bears the divine image because it was all created by God, but none of it fully bears the divine image. But in the latter times, he speaks by his Son, who bears the divine image. And so therefore, his communication has complete fidelity, whereas by implication, the communication of the prophets does not have complete fidelity. And in fact, a really great Old Testament scholar, theologian named Abraham Hetzel argued that God tailored his message to each prophet so that the prophet himself could understand the message that he was conveying. So we have then two periods of history, from the Son and after, and before the Son. So that's called periodization. And periodization is a fundamental concern of historians. Incidentally, this view of history as the process of change is fundamental to the Christian conception of history. The Christian understanding of history was most carefully articulated by a French monk named Saint Vincent of Lorraine in the 5th century. And interestingly, his conception of history is also the basis of the Marxist conception of history. His conception of history was adopted by and modified by Hegel, who then modified Hegel's view. Hegel's view was modified by Feuerbach, and Feuerbach's view and Hegel's view was modified by Marx, who in many ways return to the original conception by Saint Vincent of Lorraine. So very, very important. So basically, history is a continuous process that becomes discontinuous when something fundamental changes, when some fundamental process brings about a qualitative change that creates something new. And that something new will have continuities with the old because it will have been born out of it, but it will also be in some way profoundly discontinuous. So does this make any sense?
Yeah, well, yeah.
So this is probably a view of history that most of us are not familiar with. We tend to see history as these disconnected events and things, and that's not actually what history is at all, or what history should be, and it's not what the Christian conception of history is. So it's important that we, and especially that's in America, the sad fact is we have no history. We live without history because our history is a total lie, which makes everything worse and makes history harder to see. So given that, so generally historians characterize the pre-colonial period, so before the Columbus invasion, then the colonial period, then period of the American Revolution and the birth of a new nation, then the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, World War I, and the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, then the New Deal. So how do you think American history should be periodized, and why?
Well, it could be periodized based on slavery.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, you have the pre-colonial period is when slavery began, or the pre-colonial period. And then it would go to the Emancipation Proclamation, would be a turning point. But after that, I don't know, maybe we'd have to go all the way to the Civil Rights Movement before you could turn again.
Uh-huh. That's a possibility. Any other thoughts?
Something in terms of migratory changes, the influx of immigrants and the westward movement, during more industrialization, the movement from farming in the South towards the cities where there was more industry.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe, like, I don't know, the tech stuff that we do now.
How are those continuous and discontinuous?
Well, at certain times there were more influx of immigrants than others,
Right.
depending on what the labor needs were.
Uh-huh. The way that I would periodize American history is that the American Revolution marks a fundamental turning point,
True.
largely because the white elites assumed sole control of the country. And I would argue that we're still in the same period that begins with the American Revolution.
Well,
That
if you're basing it on the white elites having the most power, then you're absolutely right. That hasn't changed.
and also, that slavery has ended, but no fundamental change really occurred other than the slaves being liberated. They were liberated with nothing.
This is true.
So that systems of oppression and dependence continue to exist, and they've never been dismantled. The basic, we starting in the period of the defense of the defense of slavery in the antebellum South, and then the racism of the Jim Crow era. We saw that the entire ideology of the defense of racism fell into place, and it continues to be used in a fundamental way. Some of the parameters have changed, but nothing fundamental has changed. So for example, blacks were given the right to vote. Now that's being taken away. We've gotten absolutely nowhere. Violence against people of color generally is now becoming more and more common, and in some sense even fashionable, and is promoted by elites, especially in the Trump wing of the Republican Party, and in Republicans supporting Trump, who are in some cases even openly advocating murder, as in Paul Gosar, who is supposed to be a Roman Catholic, and his memes about murdering Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez.
I have one question. I was thinking maybe we know more. I mean, you were saying, more blacks are being accosted, or, there's violence against them. But is it really that we know more because of our phones, the videos and all that? I mean, it's been going, we all know it's obviously from this book. I mean, you think it's increased? You said more and more. I'm just wondering about that. Or if it's the same. I mean, it's horrible. I mean, maybe it doesn't matter, but I'm just wondering if it's changed. You're saying we haven't improved, right? Like we haven't fixed the problem, obviously, but is that what you're?
Yeah, I'm saying we haven't improved, that the problems have kind of been swept under the rug or have assumed a new form. So racism persists in phrases like states' rights or government overreach or whatever. I mean, there are a number of all kinds of justifications, but they all serve the same purpose. And I mean, at least in terms of cases, I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Center, I mean, a number of organizations have tracked instances of racist violence, and they all find that they're on the increase, and particularly the beginning of Trump's campaign marked a real turning point in the upsurge of racist violence and violence directed against people of color. Although on the other hand, I mean, it's true that it also has been a constant. So and particularly any major sort of crisis from outside or any major crisis from non-white Anglo-Saxon groups tends to, create an upsurge of violence. So, after 9/11, there were attacks on Muslims and also incidental attacks on Hindus who whites couldn't distinguish from Muslims. So that sort of thing. I mean, those are all common, and yet the violence has been on the increase. So I would argue one single period from the American Revolution on, and not exactly a brilliant march of progress either. So with that, we should turn to this chapter. Were there any thoughts or comments or remarks about it?
It was short. It was too short. I read it early. It was too short, and I had to go back today and kind of refresh my memory about it.
Uh-huh.
The longer chapters, I read bits and bits, and I'm just ending it up before Thursday. But I was really impressed by that business about the gathering in Chicago, the World's Fair or whatever.
Yeah.
That there would be a colored Americans Day.
Yeah.
I mean, that just blew my mind.
Uh-huh.
And the whole other thing of how they were unrepresentative, and the one group, a bunch of Africans who came from a French colony were put on display. I can't imagine that happening. Well, I can imagine it happening. I shouldn't say that, but oh
Yeah.
my God. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways, this chapter was shorter and in a lot of ways somewhat disconnected. It tended to be more sort of event focused and to flow not quite as well as previous chapters.
Mm.
He did, however, begin by he not quite begin, but he did note Catholicism for the first time.
Yes.
noted-
I noticed that.
Yeah, he
We
noted.
were front and center in being complicit too.
Yeah, it's
Just
yeah,
not just about us.
misery loves company, so it's good that we can join everybody else.
That's right.
So he mentioned Augustus Tolbert, who we discussed last week. But then he also mentioned the influx of Catholic immigrants. That's the first question. In his discussion of Catholicism, Jemar notes that Catholics from Ireland, Central Europe, and Southern and Eastern Europe rapidly adapted to the racism of American culture. Why might this be?
It would be helpful to them.
Oh, so
They were considered white.
mhm.
I think it's also, like you say, helpful to them. I mean, they recognize that the black person was on the bottom rung, and they were probably happy that they would not be on the bottom rung, because a lot of the immigrants that came because of
The bottom rung.
where they were the bottom rung, the Catholics in Ireland, and or they were not necessarily for their religion, but they'd be on the bottom rung because of the class systems in their own countries. And so now
Mhm.
they
Irish Catholics were certainly on the bottom rung.
well, this is true,
Yeah,
but I don't think it was quite that bad in the other places.
German Catholics are really sort of on the bottom rung too, in a society that is, or a nation that is officially, or a set of nations that for the most part are officially Lutheran. So Lutheranism, was a state religion in the German states in which
Right.
it was predominant. That's not true of either Southern Europe, like the Italians, or the South Slavs, or the Eastern Slavs, or for the Italians, obviously, Catholicism is the predominant religion, almost the exclusive religion of the area. For the South Slavs, aside from the Serbs, Roman Catholicism again is the dominant religion. Then for the northern Slavs, the Poles and the Slovaks, Catholicism is also the dominant religion. And then for Serbs and the Eastern Slavs, Greek Orthodoxy or Russian Orthodoxy is the predominant religion. But often there's this assumption that, if we look at the material from period in which of large massive immigration of Irish, of Germans, of Slavs, in each case we read these descriptions of how these foreign peoples who are subhuman, barbaric, unable to adapt to our culture, unable to adapt to the rigors of civilization, are bombarding our country, very much like Trump is complaining about the crisis at the southern border, and all these criminals are trying to get in. So it's often assumed that the oppressed should stick together, and all of the new immigrants were oppressed.
Yeah, that's why they came.
That's why they came, and they remained oppressed here.
But not the way the blacks have been oppressed. I mean, the immigrant groups that they're talking about here have moved on.
Right, they moved on. That's true. But why didn't they stick together?
Well, going on what my husband would tell me about, because he grew up in northern New Jersey, where even the Catholic Church you went to reflected what your heritage was. They all were like rivals of each other, the groups. And that may not be what you're looking at. I'm just throwing that out.
No, that actually wasn't what I was.
Immigrants went to a German church.
Yeah, that actually wasn't what I was thinking of, but that's really good because that's a good point. So, I mean, it reminds me when I was growing up, my hometown had 3 Catholic churches. There was an Irish and Italian church. Both my mother and I, after my father died, would really have liked to have gone to the Irish and Italian church. It was very liberating. It was, the homilies were spiritually fulfilling. They brought a sense of nearness to God. The Monsignor at the church was really outstanding, and after he died, the priests who were at the church really were outstanding. And so, you went and you felt the presence of God, but we couldn't go because we weren't Irish or Italian or French. There were a small number of the original French settlers in the area who also went there. So there was that. There was a Croatian and Slovak and Slovenian church, which we had to go to because we were Croats. Then there was a Polish church, but although there really wasn't a great deal of Irish and Italian and Croatian and whatever animosity, there was a great deal of animosity between Croats, Slovaks, Slovenians on the one hand, and Poles on the other. In fact, they had been a single church, but the Croats, Slovenians, and Slovaks didn't like the Poles. So, but the church used to be organized very heavily on an ethnic basis. Right? And so it was kind of all about one's ethnicity, often at the exclusion of other ethnic groups. So, I mean, in some ways that really extends very well to racism.
Yep.
So you're right, that's a really good point. And in fact, I'm glad you brought that up.
I grew up in the DC area and we just had churches, parishes drawn sort of like voting districts, your lines are drawn. And when I met him and he started talking about this church, the Irish church, the German church, so this church or that church, it was like a whole, I mean, it would never occur to me that something like that would happen.
Right.
I did not grow up in an immigrant focused society. I was in DC where it was a
Right,
big
that's
melting
true.
pot.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was just amazed me.
Mm-hmm.
According to him, the Irish didn't have their own church in his area. They had to go to the bishop's church, because they weren't good enough to have their own church.
Right.
I was Irish. I don't know. I took a lot of put downs like that in
Uh-huh.
my life.
Right.
Anyway, progressing on.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, in some ways, the church itself in areas of large immigrant populations tended to breed ethnic conflict, even among Catholics.
Oh, definitely among Catholics. Yeah.
Yeah. So what else?
That's why they adapted to the culture so well, the racist culture. Well, they could relate to it. There was always higher ups and lower downs, and they didn't want to be on the lowest rung. And here was tailor-made. They just claimed to be white. That's all they had to do is claim to be white, and they were automatically buying into the culture, and it helped them.
Mm-hmm. Right. There are a number of considerations. I mean, we often look at it from the viewpoint of the oppressed who are adapting, which is valuable in some ways. They're also under enormous pressure to assimilate.
Oh, yeah.
Looking at the example of my father, for example, he came in 1905, and he was very ashamed of being a Croatian. He, in fact, never identified himself as a Croatian.
Hmm.
And I didn't know, in fact, where he came from until when I took a class in philosophy when I was at Michigan, and we had a visiting professor from Yugoslavia, and he knew my family. He was from the village next to my father's. So I found out, about my father's heritage from him,
Mhm.
but Croatian was not to be spoken in our house. There was only English. My father became extremely upset if he heard my mother speaking anything other than English.
Mm.
It just wasn't supposed to happen. So you're supposed to assimilate. There was a real pressure to do that. And if you didn't, there were consequences.
Yeah.
But also, it's also important to look at it from the viewpoint of elites, because the reality is where people are able to unite those who are oppressed, they become extremely powerful. So we saw, I mean, the original legislation limiting marriage and trying to separate slaves from indentured servants
Mm.
stemmed from the fact that slaves and indentured servants were intermarrying, and that they had a great deal of common, and they could recognize that they had a great deal of common, and they formed common bonds. And those common bonds were threatening to slave owners. In fact, they could easily destroy slave society. And so, something has to be done to stop that. And so one of the things we never look at, or rarely look at, is the importance of elites in driving, the basic system of racism.
Mm.
And so we tend to see it kind of as a collection of attitudes, and it's much more than that. It's often a power system imposed from top down.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Yeah.
So, I mean,
It
it's
isn't just
I
that.
mean, it's a basic, some of it is the basic sort of theme of divide and conquer, which starts with the Romans, that you can give considerable decentralized authority to particular groups as long as you keep them fighting with all of the groups around them. Then they depend on you for support against the groups against which they're fighting. And failing that kind of decentralized authority, and we have, we have, say, by Trump Republicans, a basically very naked appeal to being white, and a very blatant appeal to racism, so that you're simply privileged and should be able to capitalize on your privileges, which are in some mysterious way being taken away from you. The argument is really self-serving for those advocating it, since the goal is ultimately their own self-enrichment. And I mean, Trump's goal is to enrich himself, is to enrich those who support him, the elites who support him. He cares, not a whit about, popular support for himself. He doesn't care about those people. It's all about really fundamentally forming a Russian-style kleptocracy, which is really what Putin has. The reverse of the Robin Hood model, where Robin Hood, the poor steal from the rich,
Mm.
or Robin Hood steals from the rich to give to the poor.
Right.
In kleptocracy, the rich steal from the poor to enrich themselves. And that's kleptocracy. That's what Putin does, supported by appeals to Russian nationalism and the restoration of the glory of imperial Russia, which didn't really have any. And that's really Trump's appeal too. And central to it is racism. Any other thoughts or comments about this?
But for Putin, it's more just ego, right? I mean, they're both like super ego freaks, but his is more of ego, and he wants his own, to have a statue like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. I think it's not racism, would you say? Or would you?
Well, it's certainly ethnocentrism. He's appealing to great Russian nationalism,
Right.
which has been, sort of a consistent problem, or not a consistent problem. It's been certainly a huge problem in imperial Russia, lesser of a problem, but still a problem in the Soviet Union, and now has resurfaced as a major problem. And we tend to see Putin as being, egocentric or whatever, but I'm not sure that that's and I'm sure he is. Most authoritarian dictators are, and Trump certainly is. But I don't know that that's the real, sort of motivation. I think the real motivation is that you have to have, if you want to have a good kleptocracy, you have to make yourself appear to be virtuous. You have to stand for something that is somebody considers great. And so, it's making America great again, or it's defending great Russians who are horribly oppressed by, Ukrainians. And next they'll be oppressed by Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians, and probably oppressed by Poles, and so we can see. But the important thing is that if you don't appeal to something, it becomes patently clear that you're only a thief. And thieves don't last very long. So the basic intent of this chapter was that we not see slavery as a Southern problem, but that we see it as a more generalized problem that affects all of America and all of the church in America. The next question is, when you think of racism, do you tend to think of it as a Southern problem? If so, has this chapter changed that perception?
I don't think I've thought about it as a Southern problem, because I've not lived in the South, really, or very much. And so I've mostly been in northern states, and it thrives there too. So I haven't really thought about it as Southern.
I have to confess that most of my life, if somebody had asked me about race, I would say, yeah, that's a Southern problem. But my view of that changed well before I read this chapter. But this chapter has sort of made me realize, well, actually, just this whole study has made me realize how pervasive it is throughout the country. But yeah, I grew up thinking, that I grew up in Maryland, basically right around DC, Maryland,
Yeah.
I had relatives from Virginia and so forth. And yeah, and to be honest with you, we looked down on all Southern people, not just Blacks. I mean, my family, if you wanted to talk about it, my mother used to call Virginia drivers the worst drivers in the world. And but we all looked on the South as being sort of behind the times, not with it, so forth, like that. I mean, I did. My prejudice was against anybody that lived in a Southern state. the innate racism, which as we go through this, I'm discovering a lot of sort of unconscious racism in myself.
Mhm.
And could see how I, experienced it in my earlier life. But yeah, I mean, I'd be, I'm sure I recognized that there was racism in places other than the South, but didn't pay it much mind. It didn't interfere with my life. It wasn't, it wasn't a big deal for me. And when the civil rights movement came along with the marches and all, I'm like, yeah, that's right. Black people do need to have their voting right. I mean, it was all for it, but without, but again, it was the southern states where they were doing that. The voting
Mhm.
rights and voting difficulties were mostly in the southern states. So again, you have that reinforced. Yeah.
Right.
My experience is somewhat similar in that I have many relatives that live in Chicago. I have one set of grandparents who immigrated to Chicago, but so Chicago and Maryland, and I considered racism as an Eastern thing because we always lived on the West Coast, and when my cousins would say, or we would go visit relatives, and I'm like, are you kidding me? That seems like, why would you say that? Or why are you afraid of them? Or something like that. But now, like Mary, in looking back at my own life, I'm also never lived in the big city, so more insular in the respect of being around white people.
Mhm. Yeah.
Speaking of insular, we lived in smaller towns too. Once I was married, my husband was a physics professor, and we moved around for a while. We lived in very upstate New York, not upstate, that's Albany, but northern New York, up by the Seaway, up by the Canadian border.
Yeah.
And my daughter, who was, I guess, a 5 or 6 at the time, was visiting her grandmother, and she saw for the very first time in her life a Black person, and she was appalled. She was saying, why is that man Black? And of course, my mother or whoever it was with her was like, shh, be quiet, don't do that. But that's insular. You live in a lot of small towns, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
I have to say that for the first half of my life, or maybe even more, I didn't realize that the Ku Klux Klan still existed. I mean, I just, and when I realized that things, that there were these hate groups, in Washington, over in Coeur d'Alene, and this kind of stuff, like actual, I couldn't believe it, and so I have to say that, I sort of thought it was history, right? Like all that
Uh-huh.
stuff was in the South, and it was history. And, then, after, learning and seeing, movies and information, you learn. But I have to say, I kind of blamed it on the South, to be honest. I have to say my mom is actually, my father, I wouldn't say I never heard him ever put down African Americans, but my mom definitely was sort of shunned the Blacks for, the sloppiness and the, issues, and it's, lazy and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So,
Right.
so I kind of have to say that that's, was part of my upbringing in terms of just like what I thought was like a normal. It's sad, but also, you know, as I learned, and you know, yeah, we've got a long way to go, right?
Right.
But I still think that with so much more information out there about what's been going on, I just think, you know, I mean, as we're learning how our history is not that it's untrue, you know, I hope that that this is the beginning of you know, just making the change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The basic, you know, problem is that, I mean, there is a way in which, you know, the South is and remains, you know, very racist in a way that the North isn't, you know. So if you look at the electoral map, you know, most of the Trump supporting states are in the South, and that comes, you know, heavily, largely because of white support and largely because of support for racism. The restriction of voting rights is the most avidly embraced in the South. The restriction of the attack on critical race theory, you know, which aims to substitute an agenda based on lies and falsehoods for an investigation of reality, is in many ways a Southern phenomenon. But the problem with that is that, well, that's all true. It allows us to point to the South and kind of obscures the extent of racism in the North, which, you know, can be equally as bad or even worse.
Yeah, I feel like it's more like a passive aggressive North, but a very aggressive South, because
Yeah.
because of those lynchings and all that stuff was just so horrific. But we have sort of, the North is a little, seems like a little bit of a passive aggressive way of
Mhm.
being just as,
Although not even, although sometimes, you know, that breaks out into overtly aggressive.
Right.
There was Martin Luther King living in Chicago in 1966. And then, you know, in 1969, Fred Hampton was drugged and murdered by a combined task force of the Chicago police and the FBI. So that's, you know, pretty aggressive. And then, you know, there are constant cases of police brutality, you know, in the Minneapolis area by Minneapolis police. That, you know, is sort of pretty non-passive aggressive, just simply aggressive. The anti-busing movement in Chicago, not Chicago, Boston in the late '60s and early '70s was really extremely overtly racist. Even a small thing, I remember. I mean, I used to go to Fenway Park. I lived in New York, and would go to Fenway Park to see the Detroit Tigers play. And so one year, Jim Rice was just having an incredibly great MVP caliber season, and so there's a vote for Mr. Red Sox, and you know the logical candidate would have been Jim Rice, but the winner was Butch Hobson, who was the third baseman, who was, you know, not a very good ball player, and certainly not worthy to be considered Mr. Red Sox. But he did have one important qualification: he was white. So, yeah. So I mean, on the one hand, there's an element of truth to, you know, the South being sort of a poster child for racism, but it's also important to recognize that it can be as bad or worse anywhere in America.
Maybe even more so since we have this idea that we in the North are not racist, and where we obviously are, but to kind of ignore it
Yeah, that's true. That tends
even
to,
makes it worse.
yeah, and sometimes that gives a pass to the worst excesses.
Right.
The next question is, he discussed fundamentalism and he discussed the social gospel. So why did the Black church tend to reject both fundamentalism and the social gospel in favor of what he calls the old-time religion? This is really important.
I know, and I remember reading about it, but I can't remember.
Well, what is the social gospel?
Well, the social gospel is equality, equitable treatment of everyone. There should be equity, not necessarily equality, but isn't that correct? The difference, like our living standards should be equitable, and living wage, and
Yeah,
that sort. Rather how that, and I did read this, but see, that's the trouble. I'm gonna have to start reading right before the meeting so I remember these things. So yeah, reforming
right.
type of thing,
So
and being
pursuit of
pushed by
social,
the church, being pushed by the church.
the pursuit of social reform,
Yeah.
support for labor unions, support
Right.
for measures against poverty, support for fundamental fairness in social and political institutions. So why reject that? Or why not align with more closely?
Well, all right, I'm gonna cheat and just I did read it. The social gospel people, according to the Blacks, treated the Bible like a human book and subjected it to modern critical literary theories. And Black Christians, this theological method seemed to substitute old-time religion for a new and unfamiliar kind of faith. Yeah, so they'd rather stick with what gave them a better sense of God, a better sense of their relationship to God. And
Right, so
fundamentalists didn't even bother with trying to
so to provide some, additional, some background here, the social gospel movement was in some sense closely associated with, what we kind of, what sort of generally term the liberal German school of thought, of interpretation. And so the tendency of the liberal German school is to see Jesus as a moral and ethical philosopher,
right.
or a moral and ethical teacher. And so, Jesus as the Son of God kind of goes out the window. You don't really have to believe that stuff. And so, in some sense, the social gospel becomes divorced from traditional Christianity. So we can have that problem in Catholicism as well, not only through the penetration of Jesus, of German liberal German interpretation, but also in focusing solely on Catholic social teaching, and we can lose all of the rest of Catholic teaching, which, I mean, is sort of why I've been trying to focus to a degree on integrating them. The basis of Catholic social teaching is Catholic theology. And we tend to not want to deal with issues of theology and issues of Bible interpretation and to focus on Catholic social teaching. But to do that is perilous and I think incorrect. There has to be a unity of theory and practice, a unity of the Bible, of Catholic theology, and of Catholic social teaching, or else everything goes out the window. So that's the basic reason for for not the rejection, but the failure to align closely with the social gospel. What about fundamentalism?
Well, they didn't accept, the fundamentalists never accepted blacks on an equal footing.
Right, but why didn't blacks accept fundamentalists?
Oh, because they weren't accepted on an equal footing.
I mean, that's partly true, yes, but aside from that, why not? What are how does fundamentalism differ from what would have been what Tisby calls the old time religion?
Well, this whole idea of that you're saved once and for all, and it doesn't matter what you do, you're still saved. I don't think that would fit into the view of a person who is really enraptured by sort of I don't know, very spiritual experiences.
But it's not necessarily saved once and for all. That's not, a common, even among fundamentalists today. That's probably the most common view, but not the sole view. And throughout, for much of the period that we're talking about, it's in terms of its acceptance, the notion of once saved, always saved has been growing. So it wasn't always the case. But with that qualification, you're right. So the fundamentalism aims at, its basically sole focus is the conversion of individuals, the saving of souls. And then through the saving of souls, society becomes changed. But there's both no evidence for that and no reason to think that that is going to happen if the sole focus is on the saving of souls.
And there needs to be some living out of what you believe and not just stop at saving my soul. Right? I mean, in other words, I'm saving my soul because I'm not dancing, I'm not smoking, I'm not drinking. So I'm saving my soul. And that's more the fundamentalist view, if I got that understood correctly.
Yeah, and then, and then in some ways, society improves if we all live out that morality. So if we all express this personal holiness, then society improves. But the problem with that is that personal holiness determines what I do. So I don't drink, I don't swear, I don't, whatever, don't engage in sexually promiscuous acts. I don't, do any of a host of things. But the critical question really is that it ignores what I don't do. And so, in the Confiteor, there's that unfortunate thing for what I have failed to do. And unfortunately, very frequently that what I have failed to do, in Catholic teaching is a mortal sin. It's not, it's not a little, it's not a little ditty I kind of forgot. It's often a kind of really big thing. Like I have been complicit in racism. I have stood by and watched murder, making me guilty of it. I have driven people, I have misrepresented the nature of God and caused people to reject God, which then becomes attributed to me. That's kind of a big what I have failed to do. Those are all big what I have failed to do. So we've talked about the theology of salvation and the theology of creation and the damage done when we focus only on the theology of salvation. There has to be both. We have to integrate all of Catholic theology. We have to integrate all of Catholic understanding of the Bible, and we have to integrate all of Catholic social teaching together. We can't have, these separations. And a really critical component of that integration is theology, which often people don't like to deal with or see as abstract or too esoteric or something, but that's a profound misunderstanding.
So so the Black Church rejected both that misunderstanding, the fundamentalists, and the social gospel, which was sort of devoid of any theological components.
Yeah, the social gospel, in some sense, removes God,
Yes, right, becomes just
and the fundamentalist
social
position
yeah.
is just preach the gospel, which removes half of the gospel.
Right.
It just happens to remove the parts that the social gospel doesn't remove.
Right.
So either way, you end up with this kind of crippled gospel. But the point is that preaching the gospel involves the entire gospel, which is about God and which is about loving God, about loving neighbor, and about revealing the image of Christ in the world. Each of us as a believer, as a disciple of Christ, is called to reveal Christ to the world. The church as an institution is called to reveal Christ to the world. And so that involves bringing to the world the gospel message as a whole and not some small part of it,
Right.
not just salvation.
And the
Not just,
Black churches recognize that and therefore pulled away from it. Is that
right, exactly. That's the point. And it's an important recognition. I think it's very, I agree completely.
would that apply to the Catholic Church as well? I mean, I guess in a way the Catholic Church could have presented itself as being rather fundamentalist, but in the time period we're talking about here, the social, well, Leo the 13th wrote that the Rerum Novarum thing. So I guess the church was beginning to pay attention to the social aspects of theology, of faith in God. They're social, like love your neighbor and involve something.
Mm-hmm.
But did the Black, well, of course, you had the whole thing of racial segregation type of thing. Catholic churches were segregated pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
But it says it doesn't really imply here that the Black church, so to speak, pulled away from the way the Catholicism is presented. Or does it? I mean,
Well,
we're Catholic Church presenting the social gospel in that
In
broad.
for the Catholic Church, there were movements toward integrating, I guess we could call the theology of salvation with the theology of creation, and ultimately, pulling away from it. In the same period as the social gospel, there was popularized, and in response to especially in the Industrial Revolution throughout Europe and the United States, in Catholicism, there was, from parish clergy and from lay people, there was an enormous amount of sort of ferment, and there was a lot of social activism that was inspired by the gospel message.
Right.
There was in much of Europe, there was a peasant free school movement. My great uncle was one of the leaders of the peasant free school movement in his area of Croatia, where you teach spring literacy to peasants so they can't be cheated and exploited. There was
Right.
organization of labor unions, and so there were Catholic labor unions. There was an enormous amount of social activism, but at the same time, for especially the upper echelon of the church, much of that was very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So Pius XI particularly backed off from some of his more, if you want to call them radical positions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And more generally, in some ways, in the entire aftermath of the French Revolution through today, the church has been struggling with
That's right.
the issue of whether we face forward to the future or whether we look back to the past. And we see that very clearly, with the attacks. I mean, the attacks that first of all started on Pope Benedict, who's seen as being the Green Pope in his time and going overboard, and Pope Francis, in many ways, carrying on and carrying further many of the themes that Pope Benedict had first, and in fact not first, but had strongly articulated, and for that he's probably less respected among many Catholics than he is among many mainline Protestants and the secular world, where he is looked at with considerable respect.
Yeah.
So it's a work in progress.
Yep.
And as I look at it, the continuation of the work in progress begins with each of us, since it's our church and we're Catholics. So we have a responsibility to carry on the work of the gospel. We're passed out of time. Somehow seems like we haven't gotten very far tonight.
It is a shame that we didn't get into discussing the Great Migration and the Great Depression, as it relates to racism.
Mm-hmm.
And after World War II. I never knew that Black veterans were denied the Bill of Rights, the fullness of the GI bill, you know, for the education. I never knew that,
Yeah,
but we are out of time, as you say.
neither did I.
Should we
Thanks.
go on to the next chapter? Or-
Well, what do you want to do? Should we spend another week on this chapter or go on to the next chapter?
I wouldn't mind discussing the migration and the World War periods and Depression and all. Seemed to me there was a lot of interesting stuff there. And if anybody's read The Warmth of Other Suns,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that
Good.
was an eye-opening book, let me tell you, for me. Yeah. That's the same lady that wrote Caste later on, but this
Right.
was an earlier book. She writes about the great migration of Blacks out of the South,
Mm-hmm,
North,
yeah,
and which is what they're talking about here.
yeah.
I wouldn't mind doing that, but I certainly would be guided by the group. So
What about everyone else?
Well, we could read the next one and then see if we have time. I don't know. Well, maybe both. See how it, just play it by ear.
Okay, why don't we start with finishing up this chapter and see how far we get, and then see how far we get into
Chapter
the
8.
next chapter, chapter 8.
Mhm.
Okay, so we should read chapter 8 and then we'll see how.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That
Okay.
works.
That sounds good.
Okay,